January, in the year 897. Rome. A city of maybe 30,000 people camped in the bones of a city built for 1,000,000. Pasture and ruin inside the walls, the great monuments quietly mined for their stone. In the Cathedral of Rome, the Basilica of St. John Lateran, a church court is in session. There is a judge, a prosecutor, a defense, formal charges, and a defendant in the place of the accused, dressed in the gold and white vestments of a pope. The defendant is a pope. His name is Formosus. He has been dead for 9 months. They dug him up for this. Exhumed from his tomb, carried into the hall, propped upright on a throne, and charged with crimes. A young deacon stands beside the corpse, shaking, because his job today is to speak for it. Across the room, the living pope who ordered all this leans forward and asks the dead man to explain himself. Everything about that sounds like a psychotic dream. It wasn't. It was a legal proceeding, full procedure, minutes taken by notaries, with a motive underneath it colder and smarter than madness. That's the part nobody tells you. Let's start with the corpse, because in life, he was the best man in the room. Formosus was, by the standards of 9th century Rome, almost suspiciously decent. Even the men who hated him admitted he was learned, ascetic, and honest, which in this papacy made him an exotic. He made his name as a missionary. In the 860s, Rome sent him to Bulgaria, to a king named Boris, who had just converted his whole nation and was shopping for a church to belong to. Formosus was so good at the job that Boris tried to keep him and wrote to Rome asking for Formosus to be made Archbishop of Bulgaria. Rome said no. Boris asked again and a third time under a second pope and got a third no. The reason was a rule, and hold on to this rule because it is the hinge the whole episode turns on. A bishop was married to his diocese for life. He could not transfer to another one. Formosus was bishop of a little port town called Porto, so he could not become archbishop of anywhere. Rome would rather lose Bulgaria than break the rule. And it did lose Bulgaria. Boris took his country to Constantinople instead. So here is the shape of the man. The missionary a king begged for, benched by Rome over a technicality. Remember the technicality. And one detail before we leave the missionary years, because it is the cruelest irony in a story made of them. Around this time, 2 brothers, Cyril and Methodius, came to Rome. They had built a written alphabet for the Slavic languages, the ancestor of the script a third of the Christian world still reads today. Their students needed ordaining, and the bishop who laid hands on them, who ordained the founders of Slavic literacy, was Formosus. One of those students, Clement, carried it to Bulgaria, to Boris, and became the great teacher of the Slavic church. So the loop closes. The man Rome would one day dig up and throw in a river is the man who ordained the alphabet of the Slavs and staffed the church of the king who begged for him. He spent his life building things that outlasted empires. His reward is coming. Formosus's real problem was that he was good at his job in a city where being anybody made you a target. In 876, a pope named John VIII put him on trial, excommunicated him, and stripped him of everything. The charges included deserting his diocese and, this will sound familiar, coveting the papacy. To get the excommunication lifted, Formosus had to swear an oath never to return to Rome and never to act as a priest again, to live out his life as a layman. Formosus outlived him. A later pope quietly released him from the oath and restored him, and in 891, the wheel turned all the way around. The man forbidden to enter Rome was elected Bishop of Rome. Pope, unanimously, which meant the Bishop of Porto had just transferred to another diocese. Remember the rule. He had become the thing the rule forbade, and armed, with the best intentions, the weapon that would be used on his corpse. Being Pope in the 890s meant being crushed between powers larger than you. The muscle in Italy was the House of Spoleto. a warlord family who wanted the imperial crown and who stood over Formosus until he crowned their teenage heir co-emperor. He did it. He hated it. Then he did something reckless. He secretly wrote to a foreign king, Arnulf of Carinthia, and invited him to march on Italy and be crowned emperor instead. In 896, Arnulf did exactly that. He stormed the city, and Formosus crowned him in St. Peter's with the streets still smoking. And then, as if heaven had opinions, it fell apart in weeks. Arnulf marched north to finish the Spoletans, and on the road he was felled by a stroke, paralyzed, and carried home. Formosus, his protector gone, died that April, about 80 years old. So picture the board when he dies. The emperor he crowned is paralyzed 1,000 miles away. The family he betrayed is marching back to Rome, and the most compromising thing in the city is Formosus's record. Every coronation, every ordination with his name on it. A dead man can't be punished, but his paperwork can be erased. The year after Formosus dies is a good year for measuring how broken Rome was. First, there is Boniface VI, elected by a mob, already defrocked twice, who lasts 15 days before dying, possibly of gout, possibly of being in the way. Then comes Stephen VI, and Stephen is the man who digs Formosus up. Here is where the pop version goes wrong. It says Stephen was insane, a mad pope staging a psychotic revenge. Modern historians do not buy it. Stephen wasn't mad. Stephen had a problem, and the corpse was the solution. Stephen's problem was this. Years earlier, Formosus had personally made him a bishop of a town called Anagni. And now Stephen had done exactly what Formosus did, transferred from that town to become Bishop of Rome. The same forbidden move, the same broken rule. If a translated bishop had no right to the papacy, then Stephen had no right to his own throne, and everyone in Rome knew it. So Stephen needed the rule to apply to Formosus and not to himself. He needed a ruling that Formosus's move was invalid without touching his own. There is a way to do that. It is monstrous, and it is completely logical. You put the dead man on trial, so they exhume him, 9 months in the ground. They dress the body in the full papal vestments, sit it on a throne in the Lateran, and convene a real court, with Stephen as prosecutor and that terrified young deacon assigned to speak for the defense. Our most famous account comes from a writer named Liutprand, and you should know 2 things about him. He wrote it down about 60 years later, and he confidently blamed the whole thing on the wrong pope. So the vivid stuff is third hand. What Liutprand gives us is Stephen turning on the corpse and demanding, "When you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition?" To be clear, the corpse did not tremble and answer. Corpses don't. The only thing answering was the live deacon, and the sources don't record a word he managed to say. The theatre was one-sided. The verdict was never in question. Formosus was found guilty on all counts. His election was declared void, and every act of his papacy annulled. Which brings us to the actual masterstroke. By annulling Formosus's ordinations, Stephen annulled the ordination of every priest and bishop Formosus had ever made, including the time Formosus made Stephen a bishop. On paper, Stephen had now never been Bishop of Anagni at all, which meant that when he became Pope, he transferred from nowhere and broke no rule. He convicted the corpse that consecrated him, and in the same stroke erased his own crime. Historians argue about how deliberate that was, whether Stephen engineered the maneuver or his faction simply wanted Formosus erased and the legal windfall came free. Either way, the machine did exactly that, and it is genuinely clever. That is what makes it evil. Then came the sentence on the body. The vestments were stripped off. They dressed him as a layman and cut off the 3 fingers of his right hand, the fingers a bishop uses to bless and consecrate. A precise mutilation. Even the desecration was on message. The body was buried in a graveyard for foreigners. And then, because someone decided that was still too much dignity, it was dug up one more time and thrown into the Tiber. And here, the story slips out of the record and into legend, so we flag it as legend. They say a fisherman pulled the body from the river, that the sacred images in the church bowed to it, that the drowned corpse worked miracles. The one source for the bowing statues admits he only heard it from other people. But you can measure the mood of a city by the stories it starts telling, and the mood was turning fast, against the living pope and toward the dead one. Within months, an earthquake brought down the roof of the Lateran, the very hall of the trial, from the altar to the doors. Rome read it as a verdict from a higher court. Then the city rose against Stephen. He was seized, stripped, thrown in prison, and strangled there, about 7 months after he staged the trial. And Rome did the whole thing in reverse. One pope rehabilitated Formosus and reburied the body in St. Peter's with full honours. The next annulled the Cadaver Synod outright, ordered its records burned, and passed a law that no dead person could ever be put on trial again. And then, a few years later, yet another pope, Sergius, who had actually been in the room in 897, reopened the wound and re-condemned Formosus all over again. You'll read that Sergius dug the body up and beheaded it. He almost certainly did not. That sequel traces back to Liutprand filing things under the wrong pope again. But the fact that Rome kept relitigating one dead man for a decade tells you this was never a personal grudge. It was structural. So, what was the Cadaver Synod, really? Not a madman's freak show. That is the comfortable version, because a lunatic is a one-off, and this wasn't. This was a machine working exactly as designed. In an age when the Pope's word made and unmade reality, legitimacy ran backward through the men who ordained you. If your consecrator could be discredited, so could you. Formosus's paperwork was a threat to every man who came after him, which is why they couldn't leave him buried. They put a corpse on trial because, in that system, the corpse still had power, and the only way to take it back was to convict it. By one count, Rome burned through 7 popes in 8 years around this, several dead in prison or by the knife. Later historians named the era the Dark Age of the Papacy, and for once, the nickname undersells it. Formosus, for what it's worth, won. The man they exhumed and mutilated and drowned is a legitimate pope on every official list, and the men who tried him are the footnotes. He outlasted them the way he outlasted everything, quietly, on the record, in the paperwork. This channel puts you inside history's weird days with the details the textbooks skip. Last time, a town in the shadow of a mountain living its last ordinary day. Next time, a man who wrote the most infamous book in history, mostly as a job application, and the people he wrote it for didn't even read it. Subscribe. The dead can't, but they're the ones who need it. We hope that you have found this educational, enlightening, and above all, entertaining. Please like and subscribe. It really does help us to bring you more and better content.